CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and the heart and soul of CSS3 is styles and style sheets. Styles can be broken down into a few very simple pieces, and once you understand the code, they're quite easy to work with. On the far left is one or more selectors. In this case, we see the selector is P, which is the paragraph selector. Notice the selector does not have the angle brackets on either side of it. There is then an opening brace and a series of properties and values separated by colons and property value pairs that are separated by semicolons. So the first property is color. The colon indicates that what comes after is its value, in this case blue. The semicolon indicates that that property value pair is complete. The next property is font size, with a colon, and the value is 20 pixels. You can put the values in quotes, but that's generally not necessary, depending on the type of value you're using. This style with a selector and property and value pairs will be seen throughout all the work we'll be doing. Much of the early work we'll be doing will be focusing on the different kinds of selectors, how you can pick out just the parts of your page that you want to work with. There are two types of style sheets that we'll be working with. Internal style sheets are sets of styles that are delineated typically at the top of your HTML file. External style sheets are just like internal style sheets, except that they live in a file of their own. There are many advantages to external style sheets. It provides for a much better separation of concerns, allowing the HTML file to worry about the semantics and meaning and design of the page, while the style sheet worries about the appearance. It is faster to use external style sheets because the style sheets can be cached. To use an external style sheet, you place a link at the top of your page, typically right after the title. You set rel equals style sheet, and then you set your href to the relative position of your style sheet in your site. Most professional CSS3 developers use external style sheets exclusively, except when they are creating the page. Because of the caching that makes it faster to load, it also makes it more difficult and annoying when developing the page, because you have to constantly force a refresh of that cache. Therefore, many professionals use internal style sheets while creating the page and external style sheets during production. To take a look at your first style sheet, let's switch out of PowerPoint and into code. To get started, we need an HTML page. I've created this HTML5 page by extracting the HTML from one of my blog posts and simplifying it. While it may be simplified from what's online, it's still not exactly simple. So let's go through it quickly. We'll begin by turning on line numbers. On line 1, we see the new HTML5 doc type. On line 4, the header begins, and in that our title. On line 8, the body begins. The first thing in the body is an article representing a blog post. and it has an ID. We're going to talk about IDs in depth, but the idea behind an ID is that it uniquely identifies this selector. This particular article has the ID post 5946. Below that is a section. It's the first section within the article, and it too has a unique ID. This is going to be the header for the article. We have an H1 that's a header 1, and that has a class. Class is the other side of the coin for ID. You can have many selectors with the same class, and this allows you to apply your style to that class across different types of selectors. Our H1 says 8th Pluralsight course, HTML5 from scratch, and ends with a close tag. We then have a general div on line 13, and its class is entry meta, indicating this is where the metadata is. And then we have some spans, each with their own class, that indicate when this was posted. On line 18, the first section ends, and on line 19, the second section begins with its own class. On line 20, we have a blank line, a paragraph with just a non-breakable space in it. On line 21, we have some text in a paragraph, and that also has a link and an image. The next paragraph begins on line 26, which has a link and then some further text. Let's scroll down. We see the section end, and we see an aside begin. Asides are typically used for sidebars or for additional information about the text. This sidebar, or this aside, has two sections. The first begins on line 34, which is the header for the aside, and in there is an H2. And on line 38 is the second section in the aside. And we have filled that with some Greeking. On line 49, we start closing out the section, then the aside, then the article, and we come to a footer. And in the footer is a paragraph, copyright 2013 Jesse Liberty. Let's run this in, for example, Internet Explorer. And IE has made some guesses about how to format some of this. So you see that the headers are bold and the links are underlined. It has picked a default font, and all of the non-header text is the same size. We can now write our first style sheet to adjust this page and to get a sense of what style sheets are like and how you identify areas in the page. Let's minimize the browser. We'll go up to the top of the page, and we're going to do an inline style sheet. As noted earlier, most professionals will use external style sheets for production, but internal style sheets while building the page to avoid problems with browser caching. To create a style sheet, we'll go into the head below the title, and we'll put in style, and it automatically creates me a closing style tag. If your editor doesn't do that, you'll want to do that for yourself so that you don't forget to have the closing style tag. The first tag that we're going to address is the paragraph tag. I'd like to set how all of my normal text is going to look. So I use the P selector, open and close brace, and inside the open and close brace, I can put my property value pairs. The first thing that I'm going to do is to set the color to black, and I can do that with the hex value 00, 00, 00. This is red, green, blue in hex. semicolon to indicate the end of the property. Then I'll set the font size, and there are a number of ways to set this. We can set an absolute size, a relative size, a percentage, pixels, and so on. I'm going to use a relative size of medium, and then I'll set the font family. And because I've been working in Windows 8, I'm very fond of Sego UI, so I will set that as my font family. I can bring up IE and immediately see the changes. Now these changes will be slightly subtle, but let's bring up IE, refresh it, and we can see the font has changed to Sego UI. Let's go ahead and adjust what our headings look like. The H1 heading is going to have a color, and let's set that color to something really clear and bold. We'll go ahead and set that to red. Web Matrix lets me pick that right out of a color picker. And I think what I want is fully red, so FF0000. And then I'm going to set the font size to extra large. And once again, I'll set the font family to Sego UI. Now, we will discuss later in this course how to avoid duplicating setting all of the font families to Sego UI, but for now we'll go ahead and do that in each of these. And for H2, I'm going to copy and paste what I have for H1 and then modify it. So we'll say for the second level header, the color will be blue. So no red, no green, but all blue. And we'll set the size, instead of X large, we'll set the size to larger and leave the font family Sego. Finally, I have a footer. And remember that in the footer, I have a paragraph. So I'm now going to use a somewhat more complex selector. And again, we will talk about these as we proceed, but this is our first style sheet, so let's get a feel for what can be done. I'll say footer and then P, and that indicates any paragraph within a footer. And for that, I'm going to set the font size to extra small. Let's save the style sheet and bring back IE and refresh it. And notice that all of our changes have taken place. Our first header is larger and red. Our second header, about HTML5, is larger than the text but smaller than the first header. And our copyright notice in the footer is nice and small. That's your first style sheet. In coming modules, we will discuss how to work with all of the selectors, the different types of selectors, to pick out precisely what you're looking for. Key to working with CSS3 is understanding selectors. There are three main selectors: tag, class, and ID. Tag selectors we've already seen. They are page-wide, and they're easy to identify. Take the tag, remove the brackets, and you have the selector. So for the paragraph tag, it's just P. Class selectors allow you to select every element on the page with that class. So it's more selective than tag selectors, but lets you select a number of related tags. And they don't have to be the same type of tag. It can be that you have a paragraph and a heading, etc., with the same class selector. You declare the class selector in the element, but you use the dot indicator in the style itself. The most narrow selection is an ID selector. IDs are applied to a single element on the page, one specific tag. That tag declares the ID, and you indicate which ID you want in your styles by using the pound symbol, sometimes called the hash symbol, to indicate the selector. IDs have a couple superpowers. They can be used by JavaScript to uniquely identify a particular place on the page, a particular element, and they're good for linking to a specific part of a page so that you can link deep into a page rather than just to the top. Let's take a look at working with these three selector types. Let's return to our previous demo where we showed using tag selectors of P, H1, H2, and the more complex tag selector of footer space P, that is, paragraphs within a footer. You will remember that the effect of these tags was to take our basic HTML page and make it look like this, adding styling based on the tag itself. In this particular case, we don't see the downside of using an H1 tag because there is only one header. If there were multiple headers on this page, H1 headers, they would all have this coloring and sizing. That may be what we want, but not necessarily. Let's return to the code, collapse our tags to make a little bit of room, and add some more specific tags. For example, we notice that on line 37, the H1 tag has a class entry title. We can imagine that there would be a number of tags with the same class entry title. We can style the entry title using a class style. Let's indicate that with a dot and then the name of the class and then the values we want in that class, which in this case will just be setting the background color. And let's set that to a gray. When we run the application now, save it, bring up Opera, and update it, our H1 has a background color. And that would be true for any tag that shared that class. We could, for example, add that same class to our H2. To do that, we scroll down to where our H2 is, and let's give that H2 the class equal entry title, which admittedly does not make sense in this particular case, but will illustrate that the class will now have its style carried over. Let's save that, bring back Opera and update it, and notice the H2 gets the background as well. We'll go ahead and take that out. Another class that we might want to update is the entry metadata, which holds the posted on, who it's by, the author. That's all under this one class, entry metadata. And notice that these spans are contained within the div that has this class. So anything we apply to this class will automatically be applied to everything within it. Let's go ahead and add a style for meta prep. Once again, we use the dot operator, the name of the class, and then what we want inside that class. And we're going to set everything inside that class to italic. Save that, bring up Opera, and when we update, notice that only the first part has turned italic. This is immediate feedback that I've gotten something wrong. Let's go back and look. MetaPrep. MetaPrep is the class for the span, not the div. What we want is entry meta. Let's change it and save it and try again. Now the entire entry is italic. That tells us that we have the option of having some of that entry not be italic. And to do that, we can override the class author. So we'll add yet another style for author, which again is a class, and so gets the dot operator. But we're going to set the font style for the author to be normal. When we save it and update, we see that the italic is applied until the overriding application of the class for the author. Now what about IDs? Let's go back to our code and note that this article has an ID, post 5946. There could be multiple articles, each with their own unique ID. I'm going to choose that this article should have a background color. To indicate that I want to style the ID, I use the hash operator and put in the name of the style. And now I can set the background color. And what I want is a light gray. So let's open up my color selector and move to a light gray, very pale. And we'll take that and save that and bring up Opera and update. And the entire article, not the copyright at the very bottom and not the header at the very top, but the entire article now shares a common background color. So you can see that you can identify multiple elements on the page using the class or a single element on the page using the ID. In HTML5, we nest tags. The outermost tag is HTML. Nested within the HTML is typically a head and a body. In our example, within the body, we have an article and a side and a footer, and this can continue indefinitely. Often, it's profitable to turn this nested diagram into a tree diagram that represents the same relationships. We start with the HTML tag. Nested within the HTML tag is the head and the body, but we now show them as descendants. The relationship between HTML and body is parent, the HTML, and child, the body. A child of the head tag is the title tag. The body tag has three children: article, aside, and footer. Elements that are at the same level and share a parent are siblings. So article, aside, and footer are siblings. Title is not a sibling because it does not share a parent. And we do not recognize the cousin relationship. Under article, we have two sections. In the first section, we have an H1 and a div. The div has three spans. The second section has a P and an unordered list. Inside the unordered list are list items, two of which have hyperlinks or anchors. The relationship between section and body is ancestor and descendant. The section is a descendant of the body is an ancestor of the section. The immediate ancestor is the parent. The body is the parent of the aside is the child of the body. The relationships that we've described are ancestor and corresponding to that descendant, parent and corresponding to that child, and then sibling relation. And to review briefly, article, aside, and footer are siblings. The two sections are siblings. The H1 and div are siblings. The P and the UL are siblings, but the H1 div P and UL are not all siblings to each other. You must share a parent. The three spans are siblings as they share the div as the parent. Let's put this into practice and see how it helps us select different elements in the page. As noted in the previous clip, we've added to the second section an unordered list, in this case a list of books I've recently read, two of which have links to the book page on Amazon. We'll use this unordered list in our style sheet. I've collapsed the styles that we've added already, and let's add some new styles using some of the relationships described in the introduction. We want to explore the descendant relationship, and to do that we're going to want to differentiate between the anchor tags added in that list and other anchor tags. So let's add an anchor tag to some of our Greeking. Here I've added an anchor to my website for the first two words in the Greeking. Let's look at the page as it exists right now. Update the page, and we have two links in our list of books, and if we scroll down we have a link in the lorem ipsum, in the Greeking. Our goal is to set the color for the links in the list, but not in the Greeking. Let's return to our style sheet. The way that we indicate this anchor tag is through the parent or descendant relationship. The anchor tag that we care about is a child of the LI element, which in turn is a child of the UL element, which in turn is a child of the section element. We can be as specific as we like. For example, we can make a tag that simply says LIA. That says any anchor tag that's in a list tag should be colored yellow and no other anchor tags. Now, if we had a number of list tags, we might decide that we only want that for our unordered list, in which case we could further specify by putting the UL in front. And we can do that indefinitely to specify exactly which anchor tags we have in mind. If we save this and switch back to our page, update the page, notice those two have become a hideous yellow, and this link has not changed at all. I really can't stand the yellow. Let's make it red. Go back and update. And one of the nice things is that you see that immediately. To further explore using the child and parent and ancestor relationships, we need to stop for a moment and talk about pseudoclasses. A very powerful technique for finding just the elements you want is to use pseudoclasses. Pseudoclasses work just like classes for identification purposes, but you don't need to add anything to the element. These work on relationships. For example, first child. When you assign first child with an element, it identifies, as you would expect, the first child of that element. Corresponding to first child is last child, and a surprisingly useful pseudoclass is nth child, especially when combined with odd and even, as we'll see in the upcoming demo. Corresponding to these three pseudoclasses are three that work on types: first of type, last of type, and nth of type. You can also manipulate what item is selected by taking advantage of the sibling relationship. You can find the first adjacent sibling using the plus sign, and you can find all adjacent siblings using the tilde. Finally, another very powerful and useful pseudoclass is the not pseudoclass, and this allows you to say all paragraphs that are not set with the class type foo. Let's look at a demo of using pseudoclasses. The first pseudoclass we'd like to work with is first child. If we scroll down to the section marked entry content, we see that it consists of a number of paragraphs. Let's set the first paragraph to have its text in blue. The way to do that, or at least one way to do that, is to use the first child pseudoclass. However, notice actually that the first child of this class is an empty line, and we didn't really want that there anyway, so let's delete it. Now the first child of the class entry content is this paragraph. We'll go up to the styles, and we will say class entry content first child, and then color, and we'll just put in blue. Let's save that. Bring up Opera. Update. And notice that the first child is now in blue. The nth child turns out to be remarkably useful. Let's scroll down again and see that we have a UL that has a series of LIs in it. Before we look at the nth child, let's remove the links from these two listings. That gives us a clean set of LIs. We have 5 of them. Let's go back up to the styles, and we're going to find the nth child of the surrounding UL. I've commented out a previous style that might conflict with what we want to do now. And what I'm going to say is, for the UL, find the nth child where the value of n is odd, and set the background color, and the color we'll set it to will be D5C1FF. Then we'll do the same thing, setting the nth child, but this time setting the even rows. And we'll set this one to be the hex value FFFFFF. With those saved, let's bring back Opera and update it. And what we see is that every other line is now colored purple. All of the odd numbers, 1, 3, and 5. And the even numbers have a background of white, making this list very easy to distinguish. You can do a very similar thing with first of type, last of type, and nth of type as you do with child. For example, I've changed our Greeking to now be a series of paragraphs. If we run that in Opera, update the page, we see that it's now separated into paragraphs. If we want to change the background on every other paragraph, we can do the same trick here. This is in the class aside body, and it's every other paragraph that we want to change. Let's come up, and rather than using nth child, we could do that, but let's assume there might be other things in that aside besides paragraphs. There might be images and so forth. We identify the class, then we identify the type, and say nth of type, and we are ready to set the background color. Let's go ahead and set odd and even, and we'll grab the background color and then just copy that, paste it, change it to even, and change the color. This says find the class aside body, find all of the paragraph tags, and for nth of type, where n is odd, set this background color, and where n is even, set white. Save that, bring up Opera, update, and sure enough, we have every other paragraph with a different background color. I didn't say this would be pretty, but you can see how you can use this in selective ways to get exactly the effect that you want. In this module, we looked at style sheets, and we focused on the selector. The selector is to the left of the open brace. Inside the brace are property value pairs. We looked at tag selectors, which use the same syntax as the tag, but without the arrow brackets. We looked at class selectors, which use the dot, and we looked at ID selectors, which use the pound sign or hash sign. We also took a look at a set of pseudo-classes that can be used to identify specific sets of elements based on their relationship to a given element. We looked at the fact that HTML creates containment, and that containment can be represented as a tree.